Jagged canyons cut through the horizon as the sun began to dip below the painted mesas of Arizona Territory, casting long shadows that stretched across the wheat field like skeletal fingers. Josephine Bennett pushed her weary body forward, each step more difficult than the last as sweat dripped from her brow despite the cooling evening air. 3 days without proper food and barely enough water to wet her lips had taken their toll, but she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to freedom. The last rays of sunlight caught the gold locket around her neck, the only possession she had managed to keep when she fled. Inside was a small photograph of her parents, both gone now, victims of the influenza that had swept through Boston 2 years prior in the terrible epidemic of 1876. That tragedy had led her here, to this remote corner of the territory, where she had made the gravest mistake of her 22 years, trusting a man who promised security but delivered only cruelty. Her vision blurred as her legs finally gave out beneath her. The stalks of wheat seemed to embrace her as she collapsed among them, her body sinking into the earth. The cool soil against her cheek was almost a comfort as darkness began to encroach upon the edges of her consciousness. Not much farther, she whispered to herself, though she no longer believed it. The nearest town was still miles away, and she had nothing left to give. As the sun disappeared completely, leaving only a purple haze in its wake, Josephine closed her eyes and thought that perhaps this was for the best. At least here, among the wheat and under the vast sky, she was free. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against hard-packed earth barely registered in her fading awareness. The sound grew louder, then stopped altogether, followed by the soft thud of boots hitting the ground. Footsteps approached, quick and purposeful. "Madam? Madam, can you hear me?" The voice was deep, tinged with concern. Strong hands gently turned her over, and Josephine found herself looking up into the weathered face of a man silhouetted against the darkening sky. His features were shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but she could make out the firm set of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes as they assessed her condition. "Water," she managed to rasp, her throat burning with the effort. Without hesitation, he lifted her head and brought a canteen to her lips. The water was cool and sweet, and she drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Easy now," he cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." As her eyes adjusted to the dimming light, she could see him more clearly, mid-30s perhaps, with a face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the star pinned to his vest gleamed dully in the fading light. "I need to get to Mesa Creek," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "Please, I can't go back." "You're not going anywhere tonight, madam," he said firmly, his hand steady on her shoulder. He studied her pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her dress hung loosely on her frame. His expression softened slightly. "You're not dying tonight. Not if I have anything to say about it." Josephine wanted to argue, to explain the urgency of her situation, but exhaustion claimed her once more. The last thing she remembered was being lifted into strong arms, the scent of leather and sun-warmed cotton surrounding her as consciousness slipped away. Xavier Dawson had seen his share of desperate folk in his 8 years as sheriff of Copper Ridge, but something about the woman he'd found in Emmett Taylor's wheat field stirred a particular concern in him. She was clearly running from something or someone, and the fear in her eyes when she'd mentioned Mesa Creek told him all he needed to know. Mesa Creek was where folks went when they needed to disappear. He carried her to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chance, who stood patiently as Xavier carefully positioned the unconscious woman in the saddle before mounting behind her. She weighed next to nothing, confirming his suspicion that she'd been without proper food for days. "Easy, boy," he murmured to Chance as they set off at a gentle walk. The woman's head lolled against his chest, and he adjusted his arm around her waist to keep her secure. His ranch was closer than town, just over the next ridge, and he'd have Doc Wilson come out first thing in the morning. The night had fully descended by the time they reached the modest homestead Xavier had built with his own hands over the last 5 years. A single lantern burned in the window, left lit by Mrs. Holloway, the widow who came by 3 times a week to cook and clean for him. As he approached, the door swung open and Mrs. Holloway's round figure appeared in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in its usual severe bun. "Sheriff Dawson. I was just about to leave when I heard, oh my goodness." She rushed forward as Xavier dismounted, carefully bringing the unconscious woman down with him. "What happened to the poor dear?" "Found her collapsed in Taylor's wheat field," Xavier explained, carrying his burden toward the house. "She's half-starved and dehydrated. Can you help get her settled in the spare room?" Mrs. Holloway's efficient hands were already checking the woman's forehead for fever. "Of course. I'll put on some broth and heat water for washing. She'll need clean clothes. I can fetch something of my daughter's." Xavier nodded gratefully. "And if you could send your boy for Doc Wilson at first light?" "Consider it done," Mrs. Holloway assured him, leading the way to the small bedroom at the back of the house that rarely saw use. "Lay her down gentle now." Xavier placed the woman on the bed as if she were made of glass. In the lamplight, he could see her features more clearly: high cheekbones, a small straight nose, and lips chapped from dehydration. Her hair, a rich auburn, was tangled and dull with dust, but even in her current state, he could tell she was beautiful. More concerning were the bruises, faded to yellow and green, visible on her wrists, and a darker one partially hidden by her collar. Someone had handled her roughly, and recently. "I'll tend to her now," Mrs. Holloway said firmly, already rolling up her sleeves. "You go on and see to your horse. This is women's business." Xavier hesitated, an unfamiliar reluctance to leave the stranger's side tugging at him. "I'll be back to check on her in a bit." Mrs. Holloway's knowing eyes softened. "She'll be right here, Sheriff. Don't you worry." It was nearly midnight when Josephine stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find herself in an unfamiliar room. Panic surged through her veins as she tried to sit up, only to be gently pressed back against soft pillows by a plump, motherly woman. "There now, dear, you're safe," the woman soothed. "I'm Mrs. Holloway. Sheriff Dawson brought you to his home after finding you in the fields." "Sheriff." Josephine's voice cracked, and Mrs. Holloway immediately helped her sip water from a tin cup. "Sheriff Xavier Dawson of Copper Ridge," the woman explained. "A good man and honest too. Not like some who wear the badge." She adjusted the quilt covering Josephine. "He's waiting outside. Would you feel up to speaking with him? He's mighty concerned." Josephine hesitated. Lawmen had never been allies in her experience. Her late husband's connections with the territorial judges had taught her that justice was a commodity purchased by those with means. But she had little choice now, and if the sheriff had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. "Yes," she finally agreed. "I'll speak with him." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly and went to the door. Moments later, the tall figure of Sheriff Dawson entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Up close and in better light, Josephine could see that his eyes were a deep blue, almost indigo, set in a face tanned by years under the Arizona sun. His hair was dark brown with hints of copper where the lamplight caught it, and a small scar bisected his left eyebrow. "Madam," he greeted her, keeping a respectful distance from the bed. "Good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," Josephine replied, conscious of how vulnerable she appeared. She'd been changed into a clean nightgown, her dirty dress nowhere to be seen. "I'm in your debt, Sheriff." "Xavier," he corrected gently. "And there's no debt to speak of. Couldn't very well leave you out there." He shifted, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "If you don't mind me asking, what's your name, and what brought you to collapse in Emmett Taylor's wheat field?" Josephine weighed her options. The truth could be dangerous, but she was too exhausted for elaborate lies. "My name is Josephine Wilson," she said, using her maiden name. "I was traveling to Mesa Creek to meet relatives when I was robbed on the stagecoach. The driver left me at the crossroads when I couldn't pay the full fare. I've been walking since yesterday morning." Xavier's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes told her he knew she wasn't sharing the whole truth. "Mesa Creek's nearly 30 miles from where I found you," he said. "That's a mighty long walk for anyone, let alone a lady on her own." Josephine looked away. "I'm stronger than I appear." "No doubt," he agreed, a hint of respect in his voice. "But even the strongest folks need help sometimes." A sudden coughing fit seized her, and Xavier was immediately at her side, supporting her shoulders as Mrs. Holloway hurried in with a cup of willow bark tea. When the coughing subsided, Josephine found herself embarrassingly close to tears. "I should continue on tomorrow," she insisted, though the mere thought of rising from the bed seemed impossible. "I've imposed enough." "You'll do no such thing," Mrs. Holloway declared before Xavier could respond. "Doc Wilson will be here in the morning, and he'll have my hide if I let you leave before he's had a proper look at you." Xavier nodded in agreement. "At least stay until you've got your strength back. Copper Ridge is a quiet town. You'll be safe here." The word safe stirred something in Josephine: longing, disbelief, hope. How long had it been since she'd felt truly safe? "Just until I'm stronger," she conceded reluctantly. "But I can't stay long. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Mrs. Holloway stays here 3 days a week," Xavier assured her. "And I'll bunk in the stable when she's not here." "Your reputation won't suffer under my roof, Miss Wilson." Josephine almost corrected him. It was Mrs. Blackwood now, or had been, but stopped herself. Josephine Wilson was safer. Simpler. "Thank you," she said instead, fatigue overwhelming her once more. "For everything." Xavier stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." As he left the room, Josephine sank deeper into the pillows, wondering what kind of man took in a stranger and gave up his own bed without question. In her experience, such kindness always came with a price. She could only hope that when the time came to pay it, the cost wouldn't be too dear. The next morning brought Dr. Wilson, a gruff but gentle man in his 60s with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and hands that moved with surprising grace for their size. He examined Josephine thoroughly while Mrs. Holloway stood by, then declared her suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition but otherwise in reasonable health. "The bruises concern me," he said, eyeing the marks on her wrists that she'd tried to keep covered. "Those didn't come from a fall." Josephine remained silent, her gaze fixed on the quilt covering her legs. Dr. Wilson sighed. "I won't pry, young lady, but if someone hurt you, Sheriff Dawson should know." "It's nothing," Josephine insisted. "An accident weeks ago. They're almost healed." The doctor exchanged a look with Mrs. Holloway that Josephine pretended not to notice. He prescribed rest, plenty of fluids, and gradually increasing portions of nourishing food. "I'd like to see you putting on at least 10 pounds before you think about traveling again," he said firmly as he packed his medical bag. "That will take time, a few weeks at minimum. Your body needs to recover." "Weeks?" Josephine's voice rose in alarm. "I can't possibly." "You can and you will," Mrs. Holloway interjected. "Unless you fancy collapsing again, this time where no one might find you." The thought was sobering enough to silence Josephine's protests, at least temporarily. After the doctor left, Mrs. Holloway helped her to a chair by the window where she could look out at the ranch while the bedding was changed. Xavier's property was modest, but well-maintained, a sturdy log house with a wide porch, a barn and stable to one side, corrals beyond that, and pasture land stretching toward distant hills. A few cattle grazed in the nearest field, and chickens pecked in the yard. It was peaceful in a way that made her heart ache. She spotted Xavier by the corral, working with a young horse. Even from a distance, she could see the patience in his movements, the gentle way he spoke to the animal as it pranced nervously around him. There was something compelling about watching him work a man completely in his element, confident but not domineering. "He's good with them creatures," Mrs. Holloway commented, noting the direction of Josephine's gaze. "Gentles them better than anyone I've seen. Even the wildest mustangs settle for him eventually." "Has he always been the sheriff?" Josephine asked, curious despite herself. Mrs. Holloway shook her head as she tucked fresh sheets onto the bed. "No, madam. He came here about 8 years back from Texas, bought this place when it was little more than a shack with some poor grazing land. Worked it himself, built it up bit by bit. Town asked him to take the badge after our previous sheriff was killed in a bank robbery. Xavier tracked the men responsible all the way to New Mexico territory and brought them back to face justice. He did that for a town he barely knew. That's the kind of man he is," Mrs. Holloway said simply. "Believes in doing what's right, not what's easy. Lost his wife and child in a fever outbreak before he came here. Some say that's why he helps folks the way he does, trying to make up for not being able to save them." Josephine's gaze returned to the man in the corral, seeing him with new eyes. A widower who understood loss, who had rebuilt his life in this remote place. Something about that resonated with her own situation, though she quickly pushed the thought away. Getting attached to this place or its owner would be a mistake. As soon as she was able, she needed to continue to Mesa Creek, where Margaret, her mother's old friend, had promised her sanctuary. The days passed slowly at first, then with increasing speed as Josephine regained her strength. Mrs. Holloway's cooking worked wonders: hearty stews, fresh bread, and apple pies that melted in the mouth. By the end of the first week, Josephine was able to move around the house unassisted, though she tired easily. Xavier maintained a respectful distance, sleeping in the loft above the stable as promised when Mrs. Holloway wasn't there. During the day, he attended to his duties as sheriff in town or worked his ranch, but he always made time to check on her recovery, often bringing small gifts: a book from the town's modest library, wildflowers from the hillside, or once, a length of blue ribbon that matched her eyes. "Picked it up at the general store," he'd said gruffly, handing it to her with an almost boyish awkwardness that she found unexpectedly charming. "Thought it might. Well, for your hair, maybe." The gesture had touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. How long had it been since someone had given her something simply to bring her pleasure, with no expectation of return? As promised, Mrs. Holloway had provided Josephine with clothing: simple skirts and blouses that belonged to her daughter, who had married and moved to California. They were slightly large on Josephine's frame, but clean and serviceable. By the beginning of the third week, Josephine was helping with light chores around the house, grateful to be useful after so much enforced rest. She found she enjoyed keeping Xavier's home in order, arranging wildflowers in mason jars on the table, and ensuring his meals were ready when he returned from town. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Xavier broke the comfortable silence between them. "Doc Wilson says you're recovering well," he commented, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Says another week or so, and you'll be fit for travel, if that's still your plan." Josephine's hands stilled in their work. She had been mending a tear in one of his shirts. The thought of leaving should have brought relief, but instead, she felt an unexpected pang of regret. "Yes," she said softly. "I should continue to Mesa Creek. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long already." Xavier turned to look at her then, his blue eyes searching her face. "It's no imposition, Josephine. Truth be told, it's been nice having you here." The simple admission hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "I've enjoyed being here too," she admitted. "More than I expected to." His expression softened, and for a moment, she thought he might reach for her hand, but he seemed to think better of it, turning back to the sunset. "You never did tell me what you're running from," he said quietly. Josephine tensed. What makes you think I'm running? 8 years wearing this badge teaches a man to recognize fear, he replied. And you were afraid that first night. Still are sometimes, when you think no one's watching. Shame heated her cheeks. She'd thought herself more guarded than that. It's complicated, she hedged. Most things worth talking about are, he countered gently. Perhaps it was the peaceful evening, or the weeks of kindness he'd shown her, or simply the weight of carrying her secrets alone for so long, but Josephine found herself wanting to confide in him. I was married, she began hesitantly, in Boston. My husband, Charles Blackwood, was a banker, much older than me. After my parents died in the influenza outbreak, I had few options. He had been a business associate of my father's and offered marriage as a solution to my predicament. Xavier listened silently, his expression giving nothing away. At first, he seemed kind enough, if distant. But after the wedding, she swallowed hard. He changed. Or perhaps he simply showed his true nature. He was controlling, possessive. When I displeased him, Her voice faltered. The bruises, Xavier said, his tone deceptively calm though she could see the tension in his jaw. Josephine nodded. It grew worse over time. When I learned he had lost much of his fortune in bad investments and planned to sell me to settle a debt with a business partner, she broke off, the memory still raw. I took what little money I had saved and fled. I had corresponded with my mother's friend in Mesa Creek over the years. She offered me sanctuary if I could reach her. Xavier's hands had tightened into fists during her story, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke. Is he looking for you? I believe so, she admitted. He's not a man who accepts defeat easily, and in his mind, I belong to him. I've been careful, but I fear he may have agents searching. That's why I can't stay in one place too long. If he finds me, he won't, Xavier interrupted, with such conviction that Josephine almost believed him. Not here. Copper Ridge takes care of its own. But I'm not. You are now, he said firmly. At least until you decide otherwise. The certainty in his voice was like a balm to her frayed nerves. For the first time since fleeing Boston, Josephine allowed herself to consider the possibility of stopping, of building something new instead of simply running from the old. Thank you, she whispered, surprised to find tears threatening. For listening. For not judging. Xavier's hand finally found hers, his callous fingers warm against her skin. There's nothing to judge, Josephine. You survived. That takes courage. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky, neither mentioning that their hands remained clasped between them long after the first stars appeared. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Josephine was in the kitchen kneading dough for bread when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Wiping her hands on her apron, she moved to the window and froze at the sight of a sleek black carriage coming up the drive, pulled by a matched pair of gleaming bay horses. It was the kind of carriage that belonged in Boston or San Francisco, not on the dusty roads of Copper Ridge. Only one kind of person would travel in such luxury in these parts, someone with money and influence. Someone like Charles or one of his associates. Panic seized her as she searched frantically for somewhere to hide, but before she could move, Xavier appeared from the barn, intercepting the carriage before it reached the house. Josephine pressed herself against the wall beside the window, straining to hear the conversation. A well-dressed man with a walrus mustache and expensive boots descended from the carriage. Even from a distance, Josephine could see the gold watch chain gleaming across his waistcoat. Sheriff Dawson, the man greeted, his voice carrying on the still morning air. Franklin Pierce, attorney at law. I'm looking for a woman who may have passed through these parts. A runaway wife, Josephine Blackwood, originally from Boston. Red hair, blue eyes, slender build. Her husband is most concerned for her safety. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Xavier's reaction. His posture remained relaxed, though she had learned to recognize the subtle tension in his shoulders that indicated alertness. Can't say I've seen anyone fitting that description, Xavier replied evenly. Not many strangers come through Copper Ridge. What's this woman done? Pierce straightened his waistcoat.
Done?
Nothing criminal, Sheriff. She's simply confused and unwell. Her husband, Charles Blackwood, is a prominent banker who has traveled all this way out of concern for her health. She suffered a nervous breakdown following the death of her parents and fled during a bout of hysteria. Mr. Blackwood only wants to return her to proper medical care. Josephine bit her lip to keep from crying out at the blatant lies. How like Charles to paint her as mentally unstable rather than admit his own cruelty. That's so. Xavier's tone remained neutral. And where is this concerned husband now? At the hotel in Mesa Creek, Pierce replied. He's offering a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery, $500. I've been authorized to pay it immediately upon confirmation of her whereabouts. Xavier whistled low. $500 is a lot of money. Mr. Blackwood is a generous man, especially when it comes to his wife's welfare, Pierce said smoothly. I'll leave my card with you, Sheriff. If you hear anything, we're staying at the Grand Hotel in Mesa Creek for the next week. Xavier accepted the card with a nod. I'll keep an eye out, Mr. Pierce. Though, if the lady doesn't want to be found, might be she has her reasons. Pierce's expression hardened slightly. As I said, she's unwell and not thinking clearly. Her husband has legal rights in this matter. Law's one thing, Xavier replied. Right and wrong's another. Safe travels back to Mesa Creek, Mr. Pierce. The lawyer hesitated as if wanting to say more, but something in Xavier's steady gaze seemed to dissuade him. With a curt nod, he returned to his carriage. Josephine remained frozen by the window until the carriage disappeared down the road. When she finally turned, she found Xavier standing in the doorway, his expression grim. You heard, he asked. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He's in Mesa Creek, Xavier continued. The very place you were heading. Margaret wouldn't have told him I was coming, Josephine insisted. She must not know he's there. Or, he guessed your destination, Xavier suggested. If she's the only friend you have out west, it wouldn't take much to figure it out. Josephine sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. What am I going to do? If he's offering that kind of reward, everyone will be looking for me. Xavier knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. Listen to me, Josephine. You have options. You don't have to run again. But you heard him, Charles has legal rights. The law is on his side. Maybe in Boston, Xavier conceded. But out here, things work differently. A woman who's been beaten has grounds for divorce in Arizona territory, especially if there are witnesses to the abuse. Hope flared briefly in Josephine's chest before reality doused it. Dr. Wilson saw the bruises, but they're healing now. And even if I could prove it, divorce proceedings take time during which Charles could find me and force me to return.
Sabias já o tic-tac.
There's another option, he said quietly. One that would give you immediate protection. Josephine looked at him questioningly. Marry me, he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their directness. What? She whispered, certain she had misheard. Marry me, he repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. A husband's rights supersede those of a former husband. If we were married, he would have no legal claim on you, regardless of what some Eastern judge might say. But that's you can't possibly, Josephine stammered, struggling to process his suggestion. Xavier, you barely know me. I know enough, he countered. I know you're kind and brave. I know you work hard and never complain, even when you're hurting. I know you put fresh flowers on the table and laugh at my terrible jokes. And I know I haven't felt this way about anyone since I lost my wife 6 years ago. The raw honesty in his voice stole her breath. This is madness, she protested weakly. Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, especially not for such reasons. There's nothing light about my feelings for you, Josephine, Xavier said, a hint of vulnerability beneath his steady tone. I'm not saying it would be perfect. We'd have challenges to face, things to learn about each other. But I'm offering you a choice, a real one, not just between running and surrendering. Josephine's mind raced, considering his proposal from all angles. It was rash, unconventional, perhaps even foolhardy. And yet, the thought of being Xavier Dawson's wife stirred something in her that she thought Charles had destroyed forever hope. You would do this for me? Take on another man's fight? She asked, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Xavier's expression softened. I'm not doing it just for you, though that would be reason enough. I'm doing it for myself, too. These weeks with you have been the happiest I've known in years, Josephine. I want more of them, as many as you're willing to give me. Tears filled her eyes at the simple honesty of his declaration. No flowery promises, no grand gestures, just the truth, offered freely. What if he comes here? She asked, voicing her deepest fear. He's a dangerous man, Xavier. Vindictive. He won't simply accept defeat. Let him come, Xavier said, the steel returning to his voice. I've faced worse than some city banker with delusions of ownership. Besides, a man who strikes a woman isn't likely to fare well against someone who fights back. The image of Xavier confronting Charles sent a shiver down her spine, part fear, part something else she wasn't ready to name. I need time, she finally said. To think. This is unexpected. Xavier nodded, releasing her hands and standing. Take all the time you need. The offer stands, whatever you decide. As he turned to leave, Josephine caught his wrist.
Thank.
When he looked back, she continued softly, Thank you.
For giving me a choice.
It's been a long time since anyone did that. His smile, warm and genuine, wrapped around her heart like a promise. Always, Josephine. Always. That night, sleep eluded Josephine as she weighed her options. She could continue to Mesa Creek, risking capture if Charles was indeed waiting there. She could strike out for California or further north, though with limited funds and Charles's agent searching, her chances of success seemed slim. Or she could accept Xavier's proposal, a marriage of convenience that might, in time, become something more. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. Marriage had been a prison before, but everything about Xavier suggested it could be different this time. He had never tried to control her, had respected her boundaries even while sharing his home. When he looked at her, she saw appreciation, not possession. And if she were honest with herself, her feelings for him had grown beyond mere gratitude. She admired his quiet strength, his integrity, the gentle way he treated everyone from Mrs. Holloway to his horses. She enjoyed their conversations, the comfortable silences they shared, the way his rare, full smile transformed his face. Was that enough to build a marriage on? Perhaps not in Boston society, but here in the Arizona territory, where life was harder and simpler at once, maybe it could be. By dawn, she had made her decision. She found Xavier in the barn, already at work despite the early hour. He looked up as she entered, setting aside the saddle he'd been mending. Good morning, he greeted her, careful to keep his tone casual. Josephine took a deep breath. Yes, she said simply. Xavier went very still. Yes. Yes, I will marry you, she clarified, her voice growing stronger with each word. If the offer still stands. In 3 strides, he crossed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. Are you certain, Josephine? I don't want you agreeing out of fear or obligation. I'm sure, she affirmed. I won't pretend I'm not afraid of Charles finding me. I am. But that's not why I'm accepting. I'm accepting because I believe we could build something good together, something real. Because when I think about leaving here, leaving you, it hurts more than the thought of staying and facing whatever comes. The vulnerability in her admission hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Josephine feared she had revealed too much. Then Xavier's hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his callous thumb brushing across her skin with infinite tenderness. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that trust," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. Josephine leaned into his touch, allowing herself to take this comfort freely offered. "When?" she asked. "Today, if you're willing," Xavier replied. "Judge Parker is in town until tomorrow. He can perform the ceremony this afternoon." The speed of it all should have alarmed her, but instead, Josephine felt only certainty. "Today," she agreed. "But I have nothing to wear, no ring. Mrs. Holloway can help with the dress," Xavier assured her. "And I have my mother's ring. She left it to me for when I found someone to share my life with again." The implications of that statement, that this was more than a marriage of convenience to him, that he saw a future with her, warmed something deep inside Josephine. "Then let's get married today," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Xavier's smile was like the sunrise breaking over the mountains, full of promise and light. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. It was a question and an answer all at once, and when Josephine responded, rising on her toes to deepen the contact, it felt like coming home after a very long journey. The wedding took place that afternoon in Judge Parker's chambers at the Copper Ridge Courthouse. Mrs. Holloway had worked miracles with one of her daughter's dresses, a simple blue cotton that complemented Josephine's eyes and hair. She had even managed to weave some late-blooming wildflowers into a small bouquet. Dr. Wilson stood as witness alongside Mrs. Holloway, his gruff exterior softened by evident pleasure at the proceedings. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with Judge Parker, a dignified man with a shock of white hair, officiating with unexpected warmth. When Xavier slipped his mother's ring onto Josephine's finger, a delicate gold band with a small pearl nestled between two tiny diamonds, his hands were steady, though she could see the emotion in his eyes. The ring fit as if it had been made for her, another small sign that perhaps this hasty union was meant to be. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Parker declared. "You may kiss your bride, Sheriff." Xavier's kiss was reverent, his hands cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. When they parted, the small gathering erupted in applause, with Mrs. Holloway dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Never thought I'd see the day," Dr. Wilson commented, clapping Xavier on the shoulder. "You've got yourself a fine woman there, Sheriff." "Don't I know it?" Xavier agreed, his gaze never leaving Josephine's face. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting a small celebration at the ranch, and by late afternoon, a dozen of Xavier's closest friends had gathered to welcome Josephine to the community. The impromptu party was modest by Boston standards: cold chicken, fresh bread, apple pie, and a barrel of beer, but the warmth and genuine goodwill of the guests made it far more meaningful than any society function Josephine had ever attended. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with an impressive mustache, raised his glass in a toast. "To Sheriff and Mrs. Dawson, may your lives together be as long as they are happy." "Hear, hear," came the enthusiastic response from the assembled guests. Josephine, overwhelmed by the acceptance of these people who barely knew her, found herself blinking back tears for what felt like the 100th time that day. "They're good folks," Xavier murmured, his arms steady around her waist. "They'll stand with us if trouble comes." The reminder of the potential threat from Charles sobered her momentarily, but she refused to let fear overshadow this day. "It will come," she said quietly. "But not today. Today is ours." Xavier's arm tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Every day is ours now, Josephine. Every single one." As the celebration continued around them, Josephine allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that happiness might not be a temporary state, that with this man, in this place, she might build a life worth living, free from fear and filled with possibility. The guests departed as evening fell, leaving behind well wishes and wedding gifts, practical items like quilts, preserves, and a handsome set of cooking pots that Mrs. Holloway assured Josephine would last a lifetime. Even the formidable woman herself eventually took her leave, with a knowing smile and a whispered, "Be gentle with each other," that brought a blush to Josephine's cheeks. Then they were alone, husband and wife of mere hours, standing in the kitchen of what was now their shared home. "Are you hungry?" Xavier asked, suddenly seeming almost shy. "There's plenty of food left." Josephine shook her head, her own nervousness making speech difficult. Despite her previous marriage, intimacy had never been a source of pleasure for her. Charles had taken what he wanted with little regard for her comfort or desire. The thought of sharing Xavier's bed both thrilled and terrified her. "I should. That is, would you like me to?" She stammered, unsure how to express her conflicted feelings. Xavier seemed to understand without words. He crossed to her slowly, taking her hands in his. "We don't have to rush anything, Josephine," he said gently. "Marriage is more than just sharing a bed." Relief and a surprising twinge of disappointment mingled in her chest. "You wouldn't mind waiting?" "I would wait forever if that's what you needed," he assured her. "What happened with him, your first husband, it doesn't have to color what happens between us. We'll find our own way, in our own time." Tears pricked at her eyes yet again. How was it possible that this man, with his quiet strength and boundless patience, had found her in that wheat field? What twist of fate had brought them together? "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hands. "But I don't want to wait forever. Perhaps we could start slowly, get to know each other in this new way." Xavier's smile was tender as he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "We have all the time in the world, Mrs. Dawson." The name, her new name, sent a shiver of pleasure through her. Mrs. Dawson. Josephine Dawson. It felt right in a way that Josephine Blackwood never had. That night, they shared the bed, but did little more than hold each other. Xavier's solid warmth a comfort rather than a threat. As Josephine drifted toward sleep, her head pillowed on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she marveled at how dramatically her life had changed in just 3 weeks. From collapsing in a wheat field, certain she was going to die, to becoming the wife of a man who treated her with respect and tenderness, it seemed almost too miraculous to be believed. Yet here she was, wrapped in strong arms that sought to protect rather than possess. "Xavier," she murmured sleepily. His voice was a low rumble beneath her ear. "I'm glad you found me that night." His arms tightened around her. "So am I, Josephine. So am I." The next few weeks passed in a blur of domestic contentment as they settled into married life. Xavier resumed his duties as sheriff, riding into town most mornings and returning by supper time, while Josephine took over the running of the household. She discovered a joy in homemaking that had been denied her in her previous marriage, where servants had handled such tasks and Charles had criticized her few attempts to participate. Here, every meal she prepared, every shirt she mended, every room she kept clean was appreciated. Xavier never failed to thank her for her efforts, often bringing small tokens of his gratitude: a book from the general store, honey from a local beekeeper, or once, a kitten from a litter born in the livery stable that now spent its days curled by the hearth or chasing dust motes in sunbeams. Their physical relationship progressed gradually, with Xavier never pushing beyond what Josephine was comfortable with. Each night brought them closer, lingering kisses, gentle explorations, the slow building of trust and desire. When they finally came together completely, some 6 weeks after their wedding, it was a revelation to Josephine. In Xavier's patient hands, she discovered that physical intimacy could be a source of joy rather than pain, of connection rather than subjugation. "Is it always like this?" she had asked afterward. lying in his arms, her body still humming with pleasure. Xavier had kissed her forehead, his expression a mix of tenderness and satisfaction. "It should be," he'd replied. "Between people who care for each other, yes." The words "care for" hung between them, neither quite ready to speak of deeper emotions, though Josephine felt them growing stronger with each passing day. She was falling in love with her husband, perhaps had been since those first days of her recovery, when she'd watched him from the window, gentle with his horses and steadfast in his principles. As October gave way to November, Josephine began to feel truly settled in Copper Ridge. She had made friends among the townswomen, particularly Rachel Thompson, the mayor's wife, and Sarah Wilson, who ran the general store with her husband. She had even begun helping at the small schoolhouse once a week, reading to the younger children while their teacher worked with the older students. The specter of Charles Blackwood receded somewhat with each peaceful day, though Xavier remained vigilant. He had sent telegrams to contacts in law enforcement across the territory, alerting them to the situation without explicitly mentioning Josephine. The responses confirmed that Charles and his lawyer had indeed been searching for her, but seemed to have moved their hunt northward toward Colorado territory, apparently convinced she had continued her journey beyond Mesa Creek. "We'll need to remain cautious," Xavier had warned when sharing this information. "Men like Blackwood don't give up easily, especially when their pride is wounded." Josephine had nodded, the familiar fear flickering but no longer consuming her. "If he comes, we'll face him together," she'd responded, surprising herself with her own resolve. Xavier had smiled then, pride evident in his expression. "Yes, we will." As Thanksgiving approached, Josephine threw herself into preparations for their first holiday together. She planned an elaborate meal, ordering special ingredients from the general store and experimenting with recipes remembered from her mother's kitchen. Xavier, amused by her enthusiasm, built her a new pie safe as a surprise, crafted from pine with intricate cutwork in the tin panels. "It's beautiful," she'd exclaimed upon seeing it, running her fingers over the careful workmanship. "Not as beautiful as the woman who'll use it," he'd replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she'd come to adore. The morning before Thanksgiving dawned clear and cold, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the winter to come. Josephine rose early, eager to begin cooking, only to find herself overwhelmed by a wave of nausea as she entered the kitchen. The sensation passed quickly, but returned with greater force when she attempted to knead bread dough an hour later. "Are you feeling all right?" Xavier asked, concern evident in his voice as he found her seated at the table, head in her hands. "You're pale." "Just a touch of something," she assured him. "Nothing serious. Perhaps I'm overtired with all the preparations." Xavier's expression remained doubtful, but he didn't press the issue. "I need to ride into town. Judge Parker wants to discuss a case before the holiday. Will you be all right on your own for a few hours?" Josephine nodded, already feeling somewhat better. "Of course. I have plenty to keep me busy here." After he left, she continued her cooking, working through the periodic waves of queasiness. It wasn't until she was reaching for the cinnamon on a high shelf and felt her dress strain slightly across her middle that a different possibility occurred to her. Counting back in her mind, she realized her monthly cycle was overdue by several weeks. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. A baby. Their baby. Xavier's child growing inside her. The possibility was overwhelming in its implications. She was so lost in contemplation that she almost missed the sound of an approaching carriage. Moving to the window, she froze at the sight of the sleek black vehicle she had hoped never to see again. It was the same carriage that had brought Franklin Pierce to their door over 2 months ago, but this time it was not the lawyer who descended onto their property. Charles Blackwood stood in her yard, as impeccably dressed as ever in a fine wool suit and beaver skin hat. He was a handsome man in the conventional sense, tall, with carefully styled brown hair now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, and sharp features that could appear aristocratic or cruel, depending on his mood. At the moment, his expression was one of cool determination as he surveyed the ranch house. Panic clawed at Josephine's throat, her hand instinctively moving to her abdomen in a protective gesture. Xavier was in town, at least an hour away, even if someone managed to alert him. She was alone with the man who had haunted her nightmares for months. For a wild moment, she considered fleeing out the back door, making for the shelter of the barn or the woods beyond. But something stopped her, perhaps the thought of the child she might be carrying, or perhaps the realization that she was tired of running.
This was her home now.
She would not be driven from it. With trembling hands, she took Xavier's shotgun from its place above the door, checking that it was loaded as he had taught her. She had never fired it, but the weight of it in her hands was reassuring. She would not use it unless absolutely necessary, but Charles needed to understand that she was no longer the cowed woman who had fled Boston. A sharp knock sounded at the door. Taking a deep breath, Josephine positioned herself in the center of the room, the shotgun held ready but pointed at the floor. "Come in," she called, proud that her voice remained steady. The door swung open, and Charles stepped inside, removing his hat with the practiced grace of a society gentleman. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his gray eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance, the simple cotton dress, her hair pulled back in a practical braid, the shotgun in her hands. "Josephine," he finally said, his cultured voice as coldly precise as she remembered. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear." "I'm not your dear," she replied evenly. "And I am no longer your wife." A flicker of anger crossed his features before his composure reasserted itself. "A legal technicality I intend to rectify. Whatever charade you've been playing out here, it ends today. You're returning to Boston with me." "I've remarried," Josephine informed him, lifting her chin. "Legally, under territorial law. I am Mrs. Xavier Dawson now, and this is my home." Charles's laugh held no humor. "A frontier marriage to some dusty sheriff? Hardly binding when your previous marriage was never properly dissolved. My lawyers will make quick work of such an arrangement. The law here recognizes abandonment and cruelty as grounds for dissolution," she countered, remembering what Xavier had told her. "My marriage to Sheriff Dawson is legal and binding." Charles took a step toward her, and Josephine raised the shotgun slightly in warning. He paused, eyeing the weapon with disdain. "You wouldn't dare use that," he scoffed. "You haven't the spine for it." "I've changed," Josephine said simply. "The woman you knew in Boston no longer exists. I suggest you leave now, peacefully, and forget you ever found me." "Or what?" Charles challenged, his mask of civility slipping further. "You'll shoot me? Create a scandal that would destroy whatever reputation you've managed to build in this backwater?" "I think not." He advanced another step. "Put down that gun, Josephine. You're coming with me, one way or another." Josephine's finger tightened on the trigger, but she couldn't bring herself to pull it. Despite everything, the thought of taking a life, even his, was abhorrent to her. Charles seemed to sense her hesitation and lunged forward, reaching for the shotgun. Josephine stumbled backward, maintaining her grip on the weapon but losing her balance. As she fell, the gun discharged with a deafening roar, the shot going wide and splintering the wooden beam above the door. The recoil tore the shotgun from her grasp, sending it skittering across the floor. Before she could recover, Charles was upon her, hauling her to her feet with bruising force. Still defiant, he hissed, his fingers digging into her arms. "I'll break that out of you once we're home." "This is my home," Josephine gasped, struggling against his grip. "And I am not your property." Charles raised his hand to strike her, and Josephine braced herself for the blow, but it never came. Instead, there was a blur of movement and the distinctive sound of a fist connecting with flesh. Charles stumbled backward, releasing her as he clutched at his jaw. Xavier stood in the doorway, his expression more terrible than Josephine had ever seen it. "Touch my wife again," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and it will be the last thing you ever do." Relief flooded through Josephine as she moved quickly to Xavier's side. He placed a protective arm around her without taking his eyes off Charles. "Sheriff Dawson, I presume," Charles said, straightening his jacket with exaggerated care. "I'm Charles Blackwood, Josephine's husband." "Ex-husband," Xavier corrected coldly. "And you're trespassing on my property." Charles's smile was reptilian. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Josephine remains legally bound to me under Massachusetts law. Whatever arrangement you've made with her is invalid." "We're not in Massachusetts," Xavier pointed out. "And in Arizona territory, a man who abandons and abuses his wife has no claim on her. Our marriage is legal and binding." "We'll see what the courts have to say about that," Charles retorted. "I have influence even in this godforsaken territory." "Not enough," Xavier replied confidently. "And certainly not enough to justify assaulting my wife in our home. That alone would get you 6 months in my jail." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Charles's face. "You have no witnesses to any alleged assault." "Don't I?" Xavier nodded toward the window, where Mrs. Holloway stood with Mayor Thompson and Dr. Wilson, all having arrived for the Thanksgiving preparations. "Seems to me there are at least 3 respected citizens who just saw you grab Mrs. Dawson with intent to harm." Charles's composure slipped further as he glanced at the witnesses. "This isn't over," he warned. "I have resources you can't imagine. I'll ruin you both." "You're welcome to try," Xavier said evenly. "But for now, you're leaving. Either under your own power or in handcuffs, your choice." For a tense moment, Charles seemed to consider resisting, his gaze darting between Xavier, Josephine, and the witnesses outside. Finally, calculation replaced rage in his eyes. "Very well," he conceded with forced dignity. "I'll depart for now. But this matter is far from settled, Josephine. Remember that." "The only thing I'll remember," Josephine replied, finding strength in Xavier's solid presence beside her, "is that I'm no longer afraid of you." The words struck home. She could see it in the momentary widening of Charles's eyes. Without another word, he jammed his hat back on his head and stalked out the door, brushing past the witnesses with barely a glance. They watched in silence as he climbed into his carriage and directed his driver to depart. Only when the vehicle had disappeared down the road did Xavier turn to Josephine, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," she assured him, though her arms ached where Charles had gripped them. "How did you know to come back?" "Judge Parker mentioned seeing a fancy Eastern-looking carriage headed this way when we finished our meeting," Xavier explained. "Something didn't sit right with me, so I rode back as fast as I could. Thank God, I wasn't too late." "You weren't," Josephine said, leaning into his touch. "You were exactly on time, as always." The others entered, then Mrs. Holloway immediately checking Josephine for injuries while Dr. Wilson examined the splintered beam, and Mayor Thompson declared the whole incident outrageous and promised the full support of the town council if needed. "I heard the shot from the road," Xavier said quietly to Josephine when the initial flurry of concern had died down. "My heart nearly stopped." "It was an accident," she explained. "When he lunged for the gun, I never meant to fire it." Xavier pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You were brave to stand your ground. I'm proud of you." The simple praise warmed her more than elaborate compliments ever could have. "I was protecting our home," she said. Then, gathering her courage, she added in a whisper only he could hear, "and possibly our child." Xavier went completely still, his eyes searching hers. "Josephine, are you saying?" She nodded, a small smile forming despite the residual fear from Charles's visit. "I'm not certain yet, but I think so. I've been feeling unwell in the mornings, and I'm late." Joy transformed Xavier's face, making him look younger and more carefree than she had ever seen him. A baby, he breathed, his hand moving hesitantly to rest against her still, flat abdomen. Our baby. If I'm right, she cautioned. It's too early to be sure. Either way, he said, gathering her close, it's something wonderful to be thankful for tomorrow. What about Charles? Josephine couldn't help asking. He won't give up easily. Xavier's expression hardened briefly before softening as he looked at her. Let me worry about Blackwood. He may have money and connections, but we have something stronger. We have each other, and we have this community. He won't find it as easy to bully a whole town as he did one isolated woman. Looking around at the people who had rushed to their aid, Mrs. Holloway already back to cooking as if nothing could possibly interfere with Thanksgiving preparations, Dr. Wilson examining the damaged beam and declaring it structurally sound, Mayor Thompson recounting the confrontation with increasing embellishment. Josephine felt a surge of gratitude. These people barely knew her, yet they had come without hesitation when needed. They had witnessed Charles's true nature and stood ready to testify if necessary. For the first time, she truly understood what Xavier had meant about Copper Ridge taking care of its own. I love you, she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could consider them. They had been building inside her for weeks, perhaps since that first night when he had found her in the wheat field and promised she wasn't dying on his watch. Now, in the aftermath of confronting her past, they could no longer be contained. Xavier's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds after a storm. I've been waiting to hear those words, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Almost as long as I've been waiting to say them myself. I love you, Josephine Dawson. More than I ever thought possible. Their kiss, witnessed by their friends who responded with good-natured cheers, was a promise and a declaration all at once. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whether from Charles Blackwood or the hardships of frontier life, they would face them together, strengthened by the unexpected love that had bloomed from a chance encounter in a wheat field at Sundown. The following spring brought two significant events to the Dawson household: the formal dismissal of Charles Blackwood's legal challenge to their marriage and the birth of their son, William James Dawson, a robust baby with his father's blue eyes and a tuft of his mother's auburn hair. Charles had indeed pursued legal action, filing petitions in both Massachusetts and Arizona territory courts claiming his marriage to Josephine remained valid. But Xavier had been prepared, engaging a respected lawyer from Tucson who specialized in territorial family law. The testimony of Dr. Wilson regarding Josephine's injuries, combined with affidavits from several Boston acquaintances who had witnessed Charles's controlling behavior, proved decisive. The territorial judge ruled firmly in the Dawsons' favor, declaring their marriage legal and binding. Charles, faced with mounting legal costs and the possibility of his abusive behavior becoming public knowledge back in Boston society, finally withdrew his claim. The last they heard, through telegram from Xavier's lawyer, he had returned east, his reputation somewhat tarnished by rumors of the failed suit. The legal victory came just weeks before Josephine went into labor on a clear April morning. Xavier, who had barely left her side in the final weeks of her pregnancy, sent for Dr. Wilson and Mrs. Holloway at the first sign of contractions. 16 hours later, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that Xavier would later claim could be heard all the way to town. When the doctor placed the swaddled infant in Josephine's arms, the love that surged through her was unlike anything she had ever experienced, fierce and protective, tender and overwhelming all at once. He's perfect, Xavier whispered, perched on the edge of the bed beside her, one finger gently stroking their son's impossibly soft cheek. He is, Josephine agreed, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the wonder of this new life they had created together. William, after your father? Xavier nodded, emotion making speech difficult. And James for yours? Yes, she confirmed, leaning against his shoulder as they both gazed at their child. William James Dawson. Welcome to the world, little one. The summer that followed was one of profound joy as they adjusted to life with their son. Xavier, to the amusement of the townspeople, proved to be an utterly devoted father, proudly carrying little Will around the ranch and into town, seemingly impervious to the spit-up that occasionally decorated his sheriff's badge. Josephine blossomed in motherhood, finding a confidence she had never known. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long receded further with each passing month of peace. She began keeping a journal, recording Will's milestones and her own thoughts about this unexpected life she had found. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Xavier one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and golds. Will was asleep in her arms, his tiny hand curled around her finger. "Regret what?" Xavier asked, his arm comfortable around her shoulders. "Finding me that night. Taking me in. Marrying me so quickly." She kept her tone light, though the question had lingered in her mind on occasion. Xavier turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "Finding you in that field was the best thing that ever happened to me, Josephine. You and Will, you're everything I never knew I was missing." She leaned into him, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she'd fled Boston nearly a year before. "When I collapsed that night, I thought I was dying," she admitted. "I'd given up hope. And yet here you are," Xavier murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Stronger than ever." "Here we are," she corrected, smiling down at their sleeping son. "Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had become her true home, Josephine Dawson silently thanked whatever fate or providence had guided her to that wheat field at sundown, and the man who had found her there with a promise that had changed everything. "You're not dying tonight." He had been right. She hadn't died that night. Instead, she had finally begun to live.